Welcome to a community education presentation by the Guam Citizens for Public Accountability. I'm Ken Leon-Guerrero. I'm your host and spokesperson. Today we're going to talk about what makes a life worth living. If you ask 100 people that question, you'll get 100 answers. But when you look at the answers closely, you'll see that most of them fall into one of three categories. Most people will say they want to spend more quality time with family and friends. Most people say they want a job that gives meaning and purpose to their lives. And just about everybody says they want to be able to pay their bills. Outside of those three things, every generation defines what other things make life worth living. Take these people. Yeah, the baby boomers. I'm one of them. And in our minds, we still look like this, even though the reality is we kind of look like this. Our mantra was make love, not war. And following that mantra, we created some of the most incredible music the world has ever heard. A lot of it is still playing on radio stations today. We even put a man on the moon. And these are our children, Generation X. They're a little different from baby boomers. They're a little more materialistic. And following the example of the material girl herself, they are the generation that gave us the McMansion and $4 cup of coffee. Their motto, he who dies with the most toys wins. Their children are the millennials, these guys. Now, the millennials seem to have been born with a smartphone in their hand. You never see them without their smartphones. And even though baby boomers have smartphones, millennials actually know how to use smartphones. And there's another difference. Millennials are the largest generation. They knocked the baby boomers off our pedestal. Millennials are also better educated than baby boomers were. Millennials also had more buying power than we had when we were their age. And millennials are more socially progressive. In fact, they're kind of like baby boomers in that sense because they are the ones that gave us the Occupy Wall Street movement. Their cousins in the Middle East are the ones that gave us the Arab Spring. So when we look at those things, we can see that millennials are a little bit different. And that goes back to their motto, YOLO, you only live once. So with that in mind, it explains why millennials are more interested in experiences like rock climbing. Baby boomers are into rockers. Here's a baby boomer car. Here's a millennial car. Here's a baby boomer house. Here's a millennial house. Here's a group of baby boomers on their way to an event that defined our generation, Woodstock. And here's a group of millennials on their way to Burning Man. Well, maybe we're not so different after all. But the one area we are different is when it comes to control of the future, because the future is a numbers game. And the people that show up set the agenda. What am I talking about? Well, in order to do that, we're going to have to look at some numbers. If we go back to the 2014 general election, we saw that there were 112,202 people eligible to vote in that election. Out of that number, only 49,110 registered to vote. It's about 44%. And out of the number who registered to vote, only 21,553 actually voted, about 44%. So 19% of us set the future priorities for 100% of us. So if you're in a room of 5 people, chances are only one person in that room voted, and the other 4 people have to live with that decision. I don't know if you're happy with that. I certainly am not. That's why we're prepared this video. Because when we look at the breakdown by age, this story doesn't get any better. When we look at those 45 and under eligible to vote, only 57% of those eligible to vote actually registered. I wish I could say baby boomers were better, but we weren't. When it comes to registering, only 43% of those eligible to vote registered to vote. Then we come to the election itself, and that's where the numbers change significantly, because for those 45 and under, only 40% of those who registered to vote actually voted. And for the baby boomers, 60% of us who registered to vote voted. Yeah, these guys. So, what does this mean? What is the significance of this focus on who shows up? We have to look no further than what happened in Great Britain this past summer. This June, there was a referendum. Is Great Britain going to stay in the European Union or leave the European Union? There were 38 million people eligible to vote, and all of the polls showed that the chances were very strong that Great Britain would stay in the European Union. On the day after the vote, there was a shock that was felt around the world. 52% of those who voted to leave the European Union. 48% of those who voted to stay. 4% made the difference. So let's look at how that 4% made a difference. When we look at the millennials and young adults 45 and under, they were 60% of the eligible vote. And they were the ones that wanted to stay in the Union, because staying in the European Union meant they could travel to all the member countries without a passport or a visa. They could live in any country they wanted to. They could work in any country they wanted to. Then there were the 46 and up group, the baby boomers, who are already set in their ways. Their kids are gone. They own their home. Most of them are in retirement. And they didn't like seeing tax dollars leave Britain to pay for projects in Europe. Kind of like the way, tax dollars from Virginia find their way to Guam. But they only made up a minority of the vote. So what happened? When the vote was analyzed, they found out that only 64% of those who registered to vote, 45 and under, actually voted. And the baby boomers, 90% of those who registered to vote voted. And as a result, the decision was made: Great Britain is leaving the European Union. And the people that are suffering the most from that decision are the millennials. But they only have themselves to blame because they didn't show up and vote. So now, young people in Europe are not going to be able to travel across Europe without passports or visas. They're not going to be able to live in any country they want to live in. They're not going to be able to work in any country they want to work in. So, how does that affect us here on Guam when we talk about a life worth living? Well, my hope is that our Guam millennials learn the lessons from their British cousins, because by 2030, millennials will make up 75% of the workforce. Millennials are going to be paying the bills for all the debt that the baby boomers are piling on your backs right now in the legislature. So that's a very real concern, because when surveys now show that 56% of Americans think their kids will be worse off than they are. Why? Well, let's bring it back to Guam. Here on Guam, we know we're $120 million in debt, in operating deficits for government of Guam. It is expected, forecast, that by the end of this year, when we get the numbers for fiscal year 2016, we could be as deep as 180 in the red. Revenues are declining. And with declining revenues, there's impact. For example, in the last couple of months, Department of Administration had to borrow money from the Children's Trust Fund to cover payroll. Department of Education is taking money set aside to pay vendors to make payroll. And as a result, the vendors are not getting paid. Guam Memorial Hospital recently floated a $45 million bond to pay last year's and this year's accounts payable, but they also borrowed $15 million more to pay for 2017. It won't be long before we see another bond issue on the floor trying to borrow money to pay the vendors for Department of Education. I'm just guessing. There are a number of government of Guam agencies who haven't paid their trash bill. That's because the economy is staggering. When you look at this story that appeared in the newspaper recently, the gross domestic product for Guam has declined between 2014 and today. That's part of the reason why government revenues declined. And the impacts are huge. When you look at the want ads in the newspaper, our unemployment here is almost twice that of the U.S., but when you look at the want ads, on this day there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, on that day, 5 jobs, it wasn't a lot, so I went to Guam Jobs Online. On that day, there were 84 postings, and out of the 84 postings, 68 of the postings were for entry-level or low-wage service jobs. Early in September, I went to the job fair that NAVFAC held at Top of the Mar. There were about 100 people in line before the doors opened, and I talked to 21 of the people in line. 18 of the people were looking for a job. 3 of the people were looking for a better job. But as I was looking at the crowd, it occurred to me that probably 75 to 80% of the people in that line were millennials. So when you look at what happened in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico ran into debt, and bad things happen when a government goes deep into debt. To begin with, the president appointed a board of financial managers for the government of Puerto Rico. But when we compare Puerto Rico to Guam, we can see some parallels. Puerto Rico is number 1 in the nation on debt per person. Guam is number 2. What's real interesting to note, at the time Puerto Rico declared financial emergency, their per person debt was $10,565 for every man, woman, and child on Puerto Rico. On Guam, at the beginning of the 33rd legislature, our per capita debt was $9,051, just a couple of $100 behind Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, 45% of the citizens are receiving some form of welfare. On Guam, 36% of our citizens are receiving some form of welfare. In Puerto Rico, they've closed 135 schools, which leads to crowding in the schools that remained open. Here on Guam, vendors are not getting paid, which is making it hard for the schools to operate. And we recently learned that the last 2 retirement contributions for Department of Education staff have not been made to the retirement system. Puerto Rico has closed 4 of their hospitals. The governor is trying to privatize Guam Memorial Hospital. And then when we look at this situation, recently in Puerto Rico, they had a fire in one of their main power plants that knocked out power for the entire island. They're going on 2.5 to 3 weeks with no power. And a couple of days before the fire in Puerto Rico, we had this story here on Guam. Power outages possible after 2 plants shut, another crippled, talking about load shedding. So we're not that different from Puerto Rico in areas where it counts. For example, the government of Puerto Rico can't pay all their bills. Government of Guam can't pay all their bills. And as I said earlier, the per person debt here on Guam is $12,011. It's up 33% since the 33rd legislature began. And unfortunately, we still have a couple of more months left in the legislature. This is why voters taxpayers, citizens need to become involved, because there's a bill before the legislature right now, Bill 338, they want to borrow $140 million to be paid by you, taxpayers. There's another bill to legalize waste energy so the government can build a $350 million waste energy plant to be paid for by you, the taxpayers. And currently, before the Office of Public Accountability, there's a protest over an IDIQ contract. This is a contract that's issued to rebuild Simon Sanchez. No one disagrees that the school needs to be rebuilt. The concern that I and other people have is that this IDIQ is an open-ended contract with no limit. And that's a big loophole, big enough that you could drive a semi through. I've sent a message to Speaker Wonpat asking her to put a cap on it. She has not done it. That's another reason why you, as a voter and a taxpayer, need to pay attention to what's happening in your legislature. Right now, what's happening is the result of 1 in 5 of us sending representatives. By the time this legislature is over, in a couple of months, the per-person debt could balloon as high as $18,761. That would be a 107% increase over the beginning of the 33rd legislature. And if that happens, it wouldn't surprise me if Guam becomes the second territory to get a federally appointed oversight panel to supervise government financial operations. And these guys are the ones who are going to have to pay all the bills, because baby boomers are getting close to retirement. Most of us have retired or will be retiring soon. So you guys are going to be the ones paying that. My question is, are Guam's millennials going to learn the lessons from their British cousins and prevent being taken advantage of by the small number of baby boomers? Remember, the course we're on right now is a course that was set by 19% of us for 100% of us. I would like to see higher numbers register, higher numbers vote, because if we are ever going to take control of the legislature and be able to set the course that we want, we have to elect people that more represent our concerns. And the way that happens is you register and vote. Remember, bad politicians are elected by good people who do not vote. So if we're ever going to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, we need to do 3 things. We need to register, we need to study the issues, and we need to vote. Registering is easy. You can go online to the Guam Election Commission and register online before the 20th of September. So if you have not registered, go online and register. Register before the 20th. If you're not sure if you're registered or not, go online and register before the 20th of October. If you prefer, you can go to the office of the Guam Election Commission before the 28th and still register to vote. Or you could go to the village mayor's offices and register to vote. But remember, if we're ever going to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, we need to register, study the issues, and vote. I'm Ken Leon-Guerrero with the Citizens for Public Accountability.